Do you ever wonder how the things your 1980s parents allowed without question could become so forbidden today? In the 1980s, these parenting choices shaped everyday childhood, giving kids freedoms no one dreamed of challenging. So what changed so drastically that the normal became the unthinkable? Riding in the back of a pickup truck was one of those childhood thrills that defined summer in the 1980s. Kids piled into open truck beds with the wind whipping through their hair, legs dangling over tailgates, and arms stretched wide like they were flying. Parents saw nothing wrong with it, because that was simply how families traveled, especially in rural areas where trucks outnumbered sedans and seatbelts were considered optional. Nobody thought about what would happen during a sudden stop or a swerve on gravel roads. The freedom felt limitless, and the danger felt invisible. Kids waved at passing cars, laughed at bumps that sent them bouncing, and treated every ride like a mini-adventure. It was a bonding experience, a shared memory that entire generations carry with them still. Today, though, letting children ride unsecured in truck beds is illegal in most states, classified as reckless endangerment and punishable by fines or worse. What once symbolized carefree childhood now represents one of the clearest examples of how drastically safety standards have shifted since the days when the open road felt endlessly forgiving. Leaving kids home alone at age 6 or 7 was simply part of life in the 1980s, something parents did without guilt, fear, or a second thought. Children came home from school, unlocked the door with a key tied to their shoelace, and entertained themselves for hours until a parent returned from work. They were called latchkey kids, and the term carried no shame, only a quiet sense of independence that the era valued above almost everything else. Kids learned to heat up leftovers, answer the phone politely, and manage small emergencies without adult supervision. Parents trusted their children to handle responsibility, believing it built character and prepared them for the real world. Nobody worried about neighbors calling authorities or strangers peering through windows. The house felt safe, familiar, and entirely theirs for those precious afternoon hours. Today, though, leaving a young child home alone can trigger investigations, legal consequences, and accusations of neglect. Child welfare laws in many states now set minimum age requirements that would have seemed absurd to families in the 1980s. The freedom that once taught self-reliance is now treated as abandonment. Letting kids walk miles to school unsupervised was one of the defining rituals of childhood in the 1980s. Children left the house with backpacks slung over their shoulders and headed down sidewalks, across busy intersections, and through neighborhoods where adults barely glanced up from their morning routines. Parents trusted that the world was safe enough, that drivers would stop, that strangers would mind their own business, and that kids would arrive on time without incident. Many children walked in small groups, chattering about homework or television shows, while others preferred the solitary journey that gave them time to think. The walk itself became a classroom, teaching kids about traffic patterns, shortcuts, and the rhythms of their own neighborhoods. Some routes stretched over a mile, crossing highways or railroad tracks without a single adult present. Today, though, such freedom feels almost unimaginable. Schools discourage it, communities report it, and many jurisdictions classify unsupervised walking as potential neglect. What once built independence now raises alarms that echo through parent groups, social services, and courtrooms alike. Using corporal punishment as primary discipline was something almost every household in the 1980s accepted without debate. Spankings, paddlings, and the occasional swat with a wooden spoon were considered normal tools of parenting, passed down through generations as the surest way to correct behavior. Schools reinforced the message, with principals keeping paddles in their offices and teachers allowed to administer physical consequences for misbehavior. Kids grew up understanding that breaking rules meant physical discomfort, and most parents believed this approach taught respect and self-control. Nobody questioned whether it worked because everyone around them did the same thing. The phrase, "spare the rod, spoil the child," echoed through churches and neighborhood conversations like unshakable truth. But over the following decades, research revealed how physical punishment could harm development and long-term well-being. Schools across the country banned the practice, and many states now regulate what parents can legally do at home. What was once considered responsible parenting is now viewed through a lens of concern that the 1980s never imagined. Letting kids drink sips of beer or wine at family gatherings was treated as harmless fun in the 1980s, a small indulgence that made children feel included in adult celebrations. Uncles offered tiny tastes from their cans. Grandparents poured half inches of wine into juice glasses, and parents laughed as kids made faces at the bitter or sour flavors they were not yet ready to enjoy. Nobody considered it dangerous or inappropriate because it happened at home, surrounded by family, in a context that felt safe and controlled. Many parents believed early exposure would teach moderation and prevent the rebellious binge drinking they feared would come later. It was a rite of passage wrapped in holiday dinners, backyard barbecues, and wedding receptions where everyone shared everything. But medical research and legal standards have since drawn firm lines around minors and alcohol. Giving alcohol to anyone under 21 is now illegal in most circumstances, regardless of setting or intent. What families once saw as bonding has become a liability, a shift that transformed innocent sips into something modern law treats very differently. Buying cigarettes for parents at the corner store was a common errand for children throughout the 1980s, as routine as picking up milk or bread. Kids walked into convenience stores, asked for a specific brand, handed over crumpled bills, and walked out with a pack tucked under their arm without anyone raising an eyebrow. Clerks never asked for identification because nobody expected them to. Parents trusted their children with the task because it saved them a trip, and shopkeepers saw nothing unusual about selling tobacco to a minor acting on behalf of an adult. The transaction felt ordinary, even helpful, a small responsibility that made kids feel grown up and capable. Some children memorized their parents' preferred brands before they could spell their own last names. Today, though, selling tobacco to minors is a criminal offense that can result in fines, license revocations, and even jail time for repeat offenders. Identification checks are mandatory, and the idea of sending a child to buy cigarettes feels not just outdated, but shocking. The errand that once seemed so innocent now represents a world that no longer exists. Leaving babies to sleep on their stomachs was the standard advice pediatricians gave to new parents throughout the 1980s. Doctors believed stomach sleeping helped infants feel secure, reduced the risk of choking, and encouraged deeper, more restful sleep. Nurses in hospital nurseries positioned newborns face down as a matter of routine, and parenting books reinforced the practice with confident authority. Mothers followed these instructions without question, tucking their babies onto their bellies night after night, trusting that medical professionals knew best. Cribs were arranged, mattresses flattened, and bedtimes followed the same pattern in millions of homes. But as research into sudden infant death syndrome expanded, scientists discovered that stomach sleeping dramatically increased the risk of SIDS. The revelation shocked parents who had done exactly what they were told. Health organizations launched campaigns to spread the word, and today placing a baby to sleep on its stomach is strongly discouraged by every major pediatric authority. The advice that once felt medically sound now serves as a sobering reminder of how much we still had to learn. Letting kids operate power tools without supervision was considered a normal part of growing up in the 1980s, especially in households where fathers worked with their hands and expected their children to learn the same skills. Boys and girls alike learned to use circular saws, drills, and sanders long before they reached their teenage years. Parents believed that hands-on experience taught responsibility, coordination, and respect for dangerous equipment in ways no lecture ever could. Kids built birdhouses, repaired fences, and helped with home improvement projects, while sawdust covered their clothes and the whine of machinery filled the garage. Accidents happened, but they were treated as lessons rather than crises. A scraped knuckle or a close call that reinforced caution better than any warning. Nobody called Child Protective Services over a 10-year-old using a jigsaw. Today, though, safety guidelines, insurance restrictions, and liability concerns have transformed power tools into adult-only territory. Manufacturers print age warnings, schools require supervision, and the idea of handing a child a running saw feels reckless by modern standards. Allowing kids to play with realistic toy guns in public was one of the most common sights in neighborhoods throughout the 1980s. Children chased each other through yards, parks, and streets carrying plastic pistols, cap guns, and replica rifles that looked nearly identical to the real thing. Parents bought these toys without hesitation, believing they encouraged imaginative play, outdoor activity, and the kind of adventurous spirit childhood was supposed to nurture. Nobody worried about how a passing driver or a concerned neighbor might react because everyone understood these were toys. The bangs, the smoke from cap rolls, and the dramatic falls were all part of games that stretched from morning until the streetlights flickered on. Police rarely intervened, and when they did, it was usually with a smile and a wave. Today, though, realistic toy guns have been banned or heavily restricted in most areas. Orange tips are mandatory, sales are regulated, and children carrying anything resembling a weapon can trigger emergency responses that end in tragedy. The innocent play that once filled summer afternoons is now viewed through a lens of fear that the 1980s never anticipated. Sending kids outside at dawn and not expecting them back until dark was the unofficial parenting strategy of the 1980s, a philosophy rooted in the belief that fresh air, freedom, and unsupervised play were essential to a healthy childhood. Parents opened the back door, watched their children disappear into the neighborhood, and went about their day without checking in or tracking locations. Children built forts, explored creeks, rode bikes to distant parks, and invented games that lasted entire afternoons. They came home sunburned, muddy, and hungry, full of stories about adventures no adult had witnessed. The neighborhood itself acted as a guardian, with every parent keeping a casual eye on every child. Trust extended in every direction, creating a web of informal supervision that felt safe enough for everyone. Today, though, allowing children to roam unsupervised for hours can result in calls to authorities, accusations of neglect, and investigations that leave families shaken. The freedom that once defined childhood is now something parents must carefully ration under the watchful eyes of a world that worries far more than it used to. Letting kids sit on laps in the front seat during drives was something parents did without hesitation throughout the 1980s. Children perched on a parent's knee, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling like they were actually helping guide the car. Older siblings held younger ones, and sometimes entire families squeezed into front bench seats designed for exactly this kind of togetherness. Nobody thought about airbags, crash statistics, or the physics of a sudden impact. The closeness felt natural, even protective, as if a parent's arms could shield a child from anything. Car seats existed, but they were flimsy contraptions many families ignored once children outgrew infancy. Seat belts went unused or tucked behind backs because they felt uncomfortable. The front seat was a privilege kids earned by being old enough to see over the dashboard. Today, though, strict child restraint laws require approved car seats, booster seats, and rear seating until specific ages and weights are reached. The cozy front seat rides that once felt like bonding moments are now illegal in every state. Replaced by regulations designed to save lives, the 1980s simply did not count. Allowing kids to use trampolines without nets or supervision was standard backyard entertainment in the 1980s. Families set up large bouncing surfaces in their yards, and children turned them into launching pads for flips, tricks, and games that pushed the limits of gravity. Multiple kids bounced at once, colliding mid-air, tumbling off edges, and landing in grass with thuds that rarely stopped the fun. Parents watched from kitchen windows, or not at all, trusting that bruises were simply part of childhood. The thrill of getting airborne outweighed any concern about broken bones or concussions. Neighborhood kids gathered for trampoline parties where rules were non-existent, and the only goal was seeing who could jump highest. Nobody installed safety nets or padded edges because those products barely existed. The risks were understood but accepted as the price of outdoor adventure. Today, though, trampolines are classified as attractive nuisances by insurance companies, and many homeowners' policies refuse to cover them. Safety nets, supervision requirements, and age restrictions have transformed carefree bouncing into a regulated activity demanding constant attention. Letting kids ride bikes without helmets on busy streets was the norm throughout the 1980s, a decade when head protection was considered unnecessary and even slightly ridiculous. Children pedaled through neighborhoods, crossed intersections, and raced down hills with nothing but wind in their hair and confidence in their balance. Parents waved goodbye without a second thought, trusting that their kids knew how to handle traffic. Helmets existed mostly for professional cyclists, not for children zooming to the corner store. The freedom of cycling felt incomplete without feeling the breeze directly on your scalp. Kids crashed, scraped their knees, and occasionally hit their heads, but these were treated as inevitable parts of learning rather than preventable tragedies. The idea of mandating protective gear seemed absurdly overprotective. Today, though, helmet laws exist in most states, and children without proper head protection can result in fines for parents. Schools require helmets, organized rides demand them, and the carefree cycling of the 1980s has been replaced by safety standards that prioritize protection over the pure feeling of freedom. Giving children aspirin for fevers and pain was standard practice in households throughout the 1980s. Parents reached for the familiar bottle whenever a child complained of headaches or the feverish discomfort that came with colds and flu. Doctors recommended it, pharmacies sold children's versions in flavored tablets, and families trusted aspirin the way they trusted any medicine that had been around for generations. Nobody imagined that something so common could carry serious risks. Children swallowed the pills without complaint, and parents felt reassured knowing they were treating symptoms with a proven remedy. The connection between aspirin and a rare but devastating condition called Ray's syndrome was not yet widely understood. When researchers established the link, showing that aspirin given during viral illnesses could trigger brain swelling and liver damage in children, the medical community responded urgently. Today, aspirin is explicitly banned for pediatric use in most circumstances, replaced by safer alternatives. The medicine cabinet staple that once seemed harmless now carries warning labels that would have shocked parents who relied on it without question. Letting kids swim in unsupervised quarries and rivers was one of the great summer adventures of the 1980s. Children hiked through woods, climbed fences, and discovered swimming holes that felt like private paradises hidden from the adult world. Quarries filled with rain offered deep, cool water that seemed magical compared to chlorinated pools. Rivers provided currents to float along and rocks to dive from, all without a lifeguard in sight. Parents often knew where their kids were headed and simply trusted them to be careful, believing that natural water taught lessons no pool ever could. Kids learned to gauge depth by throwing rocks, test currents by watching leaves, and respect the power of water through close calls that became legendary stories. Nobody posted warning signs or fenced off access because these places belonged to everyone brave enough to find them. Today, though, quarries and natural swimming areas are often marked as illegal trespassing zones with fines for anyone caught entering. Liability concerns, drowning statistics, and property laws have transformed these hidden oases into forbidden territories that modern children may never experience the way their parents once did. Allowing kids to hitchhike to friends' houses or events was surprisingly common in the 1980s, especially in rural areas where distances felt longer and trust came easier. Teenagers stuck out their thumbs along roadsides, and younger kids sometimes did the same when they needed to get somewhere their bikes could not reach. Drivers pulled over without suspicion, offering rides to children they recognized or simply because helping someone seemed decent. Parents knew their kids hitchhiked and rarely objected because it seemed practical. The world felt smaller then, more connected by unspoken agreements between strangers who assumed the best of each other. Kids arrived at baseball games, theaters, and friends' houses through the kindness of passing motorists who never imagined danger. Today, though, hitchhiking is illegal in many jurisdictions and considered extremely dangerous. Parents who allowed it would face serious scrutiny, and children who attempted it would trigger immediate concern. The casual rides that once connected communities have been replaced by warnings, stranger danger education, and a cultural shift away from trusting unknown drivers. Leaving loaded firearms accessible in the home was common throughout the 1980s, particularly in households where hunting or personal protection were valued traditions. Rifles leaned in closet corners, Handguns rested in nightstand drawers, and shotguns hung above door frames where anyone could reach them. Parents taught their children to respect firearms but often left weapons unlocked and loaded, trusting that lessons about safety would prevent accidents. Kids knew where the guns were kept, sometimes handled them when adults were not looking, and grew up understanding firearms were tools rather than forbidden objects. The idea of locking weapons away seemed unnecessary to families who believed familiarity bred responsibility. Trigger locks and gun safes felt like obstacles that would slow emergency response. Today, though, safe storage laws exist in many states, holding gun owners legally responsible when unsecured weapons are accessed by children. Insurance policies and public health campaigns have transformed firearm storage into a legal obligation rather than personal choice. The unlocked closet gun that once felt like protection now carries consequences the 80s never anticipated. Letting kids eat raw cookie dough without concern was one of the sweetest traditions of baking in the 1980s. Children gathered around mixing bowls, fingers dipping into batter the moment parents turned their backs, savoring the sugary taste that somehow seemed better than the finished cookies themselves. Mothers shared spoonfuls directly from the bowl, treating it as a reward for helping with the recipe. The raw eggs inside were never discussed as a hazard, and flour was simply flour, not a potential source of contamination. Licking beaters, scraping bowls, and sneaking pinches of dough were childhood rituals that connected generations of bakers. Nobody imagined that these innocent moments carried any real risk. The joy of the taste outweighed concerns that had not yet entered public awareness. Today, though, health officials issue clear warnings against consuming raw dough due to bacteria in uncooked flour and salmonella risk in raw eggs. Manufacturers print cautions on packaging, and parents who allow the old traditions face judgment from those who know better. The simple pleasure that once defined baking day has become another casualty of safety awareness the 80s happily ignored. Allowing kids to ride ATVs and dirt bikes on public roads was thrilling and commonplace throughout the 1980s. Children climbed onto machines far too powerful for their size and tore across streets, through fields, and along roadsides where cars passed without slowing. Parents viewed these vehicles as outdoor toys that taught coordination and the kind of fearless confidence the era celebrated. Helmets were optional, supervision was minimal, and age restrictions were suggestions nobody enforced. Kids raced each other down dirt roads, popped wheelies in front yards, and treated public pavement as extensions of private property. The roar of engines on weekend mornings became a familiar soundtrack in rural and suburban neighborhoods. Accidents happened, sometimes serious ones, but they were considered risks inherent to adventurous childhood. Today, though, ATVs and dirt bikes are subject to strict age requirements, licensing rules, and prohibitions against riding on public roads. Helmets are mandatory, and unsupervised use by minors can result in fines. The wild freedom that once defined off-road riding has been tamed by regulations the 80s would have found unthinkable. Sending kids to school sick without question was practically expected in the 1980s, an era that valued perfect attendance above almost everything else. Children with fevers, runny noses, and hacking coughs climbed onto school buses because missing class meant falling behind. Parents dosed their kids with medicine, handed them tissues, and sent them out the door with instructions to tough it out. Teachers rarely sent sick students home unless symptoms were severe enough to disrupt the entire classroom. The culture celebrated resilience and dismissed illness as weakness that could be overcome with willpower. Kids sat at desks spreading germs to classmates while trying to focus through headaches and chills. Perfect attendance certificates hung on refrigerators as proof that a family prioritized education above minor inconveniences like contagious disease. Today, though, school policies explicitly require sick children to stay home, and parents who send visibly ill kids face calls from nurses and accusations of negligence. The lessons of recent health crises have reinforced what the 1980s refused to acknowledge, that keeping sick children home protects everyone. Letting kids play tackle football without pads or helmets was a neighborhood tradition in the 1980s. Children gathered in backyards, empty lots, and quiet streets to throw themselves at each other with all the intensity of professionals and none of the protection. Parents watched from porches or heard about the games only when someone came home with a bloody nose. Nobody worried about concussions, brain injuries, or long-term effects of repeated impacts. The roughness was considered part of the fun, a way for kids to burn energy and learn toughness. Helmets and pads were reserved for organized leagues, not casual games between friends. Kids tackled each other onto hard ground, celebrated big hits, and returned to play even after getting the wind knocked out of them. Today, though, concerns about traumatic brain injuries have transformed youth football at every level. Organized leagues require protective gear, and many communities discourage unsupervised tackle games. The rough play that once seemed harmless is now viewed through a lens of medical research the 1980s simply did not have. Allowing kids to use lawnmowers as young as 8 was considered a normal household chore in the 1980s. Parents handed over the responsibility of cutting grass as soon as children seemed strong enough to push the machine. Kids learned to prime engines, pull starter cords, and navigate around flower beds while spinning blades roared beneath their feet. The job taught responsibility, earned allowance money, and gave children a sense of contribution to the family that nothing else could match. Nobody thought much about the dangers of exposed blades or flying debris striking eyes and shins. Accidents happened, sometimes resulting in missing toes or deep lacerations, but these were treated as unfortunate consequences rather than preventable disasters. The mower was simply another tool kids learned to respect through experience. Today, though, manufacturers print strict age warnings, and pediatric safety organizations recommend children be at least 12 before operating push mowers. The chore that once built character is now classified as an age-inappropriate hazard by standards that govern modern childhood. Letting kids stay in hot cars while parents ran errands was remarkably common in the 1980s. Parents cracked windows, promised to return quickly, and left children sitting in parking lots while they ducked into stores. Kids entertained themselves by playing with dashboard buttons or watching the world pass by outside. Nobody calculated how quickly temperatures could rise inside a sealed vehicle, or imagined the deadly consequences that would later make headlines. The practice felt practical rather than dangerous, a way to avoid dragging reluctant children through boring adult errands. Many kids preferred staying in the car, enjoying the brief independence. Parents trusted that a few minutes alone posed no real threat. Today, though, leaving a child unattended in a vehicle is a criminal offense in most states, punishable by fines, arrest, and child endangerment charges. Good Samaritan laws allow bystanders to break windows to rescue children, and public awareness campaigns have made the dangers impossible to ignore. What once seemed like convenience is now treated as a potentially fatal mistake. Giving kids cough medicine containing codeine was standard practice in the 1980s, prescribed by doctors and purchased by parents desperate to help sick children sleep. The purple syrup became a familiar presence in medicine cabinets, pulled out whenever coughs turned relentless. Parents measured doses carefully, trusting that anything prescribed by a physician must be safe. Children swallowed the sweet liquid and drifted into deep sleep while fighting off illness. Nobody questioned whether an opioid belonged in pediatric medicine or worried about effects on developing respiratory systems. The relief seemed worth any theoretical risk. Doctors wrote prescriptions routinely, and pharmacies filled them without hesitation. Today, though, codeine is explicitly banned for pediatric use after research revealed that some children metabolize it dangerously fast, leading to fatal respiratory depression. The cough syrup that once brought comfort to sick kids is now recognized as a medication that should never have been given to them. The shift stands as a stark reminder of how much medical understanding has changed. Allowing kids to handle fireworks without adult supervision was a summer tradition in the 1980s that nobody questioned. Children lit firecrackers in driveways, waved sparklers through the night, and launched bottle rockets from empty lots while parents relaxed inside. The 4th of July meant independence in more ways than one, as kids were trusted to handle explosives with common sense and respect for fire. Burns, singed eyebrows, and close calls were considered part of the experience, badges of honor earned through summers playing with controlled danger. Parents bought fireworks in bulk, handed them out freely, and assumed their children knew enough to stay safe. Nobody supervised because nobody thought it necessary. Today, though, fireworks laws have tightened dramatically, with most states prohibiting sales to minors and requiring adult presence for any use. The unsupervised pyrotechnics that once lit up childhood summers are now treated as serious hazards requiring permits and oversight. The spark of independence that defined summer nights has been regulated into something the 80s would barely recognize. Leaving kids alone at the mall during holiday shopping was one of those quiet freedoms parents had in the 1970s. They would drop you off with a handful of coins, a vague reminder to meet at the front doors by dinner, and trust that you would handle the rest. The mall was your world for the day, filled with music, toy displays, escalators that felt like rides, and the sweet smell of pretzels drifting through every hallway. You could roam from store to store with your friends, sit in the food court watching the holiday crowds, and feel grown up in a way few places could offer. Today, though, leaving a child alone like that is considered neglect. Authorities step in quickly, malls enforce strict policies, and parents face judgment from every direction. Something about that shift feels bigger than just safety. It speaks to how differently we view independence now. But for the kids who lived it, the mall was a kingdom, and those long afternoons exploring its bright corridors still glow in memory. Unlimited portion sizes with no calorie caps defined the generous spirit of school cafeterias in the 1980s, where lunch ladies piled food onto trays without measuring or restricting what students received. If you wanted more mashed potatoes, you got more. If the serving of spaghetti looked small, a friendly scoop made it larger. Schools operated on the philosophy that growing children needed fuel, and fuel meant food without limits. Nobody tracked calories because nobody thought calories mattered for kids burning energy on playgrounds. The lunch line moved fast, and portions reflected whatever fit on the tray rather than any nutritional calculation. Some students ate modest amounts while others piled their plates high, and both approaches were accepted. But childhood obesity rates began climbing in ways that alarmed health officials. Studies connected unlimited school portions to eating habits that followed children into adulthood. Federal regulations eventually imposed strict calorie ranges for school meals. Today, portion sizes are measured precisely, and seconds are often impossible to obtain. The abundance that once defined cafeteria culture has been replaced by careful control. Baby walkers without safety brakes were among the most popular baby products in the 1970s, promising parents that their little ones could explore while learning to take their first steps. These wheeled contraptions looked cheerful and exciting, with colorful trays and seats that let babies bounce and roll across kitchen floors. Parents loved how independent their children seemed, scooting from room to room with big smiles and wobbly legs. Nobody imagined that the freedom these walkers offered could turn dangerous in a heartbeat. Without brakes or speed controls, babies gained momentum faster than anyone expected, rolling towards staircases and hot stoves before parents could react. Emergency rooms reported a steady stream of injuries, from broken bones to head trauma, all tied to babies tumbling downstairs or crashing into furniture. Some accidents were far worse, leaving families devastated by outcomes no one saw coming. Investigators eventually documented enough cases to push for strict regulations, and walkers without proper safety features were banned. The cheerful contraptions that once symbolized independence became cautionary tales about how quickly joy can turn into tragedy. Children participating in live nativity scenes with real animals was a cherished holiday experience in the 1970s. Schools and churches would gather goats, donkeys, sheep, or even small calves, placing them in straw-lined corners while children in robes acted out the story of the nativity. The animals brayed, shifted, or occasionally caused chaos, but everyone loved it. There was something magical about sharing the stage with creatures that felt straight out of the story itself. Children learned gentleness and patience in ways no classroom lesson could teach, and the unpredictability of the animals made every performance feel alive. Parents watched proudly, cameras in hand, capturing moments that felt sacred in their simplicity. But today, safety and liability laws make this nearly impossible. Real animals require permits, supervision, insurance, and strict handling rules. Most places do not attempt it anymore. The warmth of those live scenes has been replaced by cardboard props or digital projections. Yet anyone old enough to remember those nights can still smell the hay and hear the soft bleats that completed the scene. Full sugar cookies and brownies served daily were the sweet punctuation marks at the end of every cafeteria meal in the 1980s, waiting near the register like rewards for finishing lunch. The cookies were thick and chewy, sometimes still warm from industrial ovens. The brownies came in dense squares with crackled tops, rich enough to leave chocolate on fingers. Students grabbed them eagerly, sometimes trading main courses just to secure an extra dessert. Schools saw no problem offering sweets every single day because dessert was simply part of a complete meal, something that made children happy. The sugar content was astronomical by modern standards, packed into treats that exceeded daily limits in a single serving. Nobody tracked grams or worried about nutrition labels because those concerns had not yet reached cafeteria planning. But when childhood health became a national priority, daily desserts were among the first casualties. Federal guidelines now restrict how often schools can serve sweet treats and cap the sugar content of anything that appears. The cookies and brownies that remain are smaller, less sweet, and reserved for occasional appearances rather than daily indulgence. Crib bumper pads with thick cushioning were considered essential nursery items in the 1970s, soft barriers that parents wrapped around cribs to protect tiny heads from hard wooden slats. The padding looked cozy and reassuring, turning a bare crib into something that felt safer and more comfortable for a sleeping infant. Parents tucked these bumpers tightly against the rails, believing they were shielding their babies from bruises and drafts. Advertisements showed peaceful nurseries with plump quilted bumpers framing sleeping babies like protective clouds. What nobody discussed was how easily an infant could roll against that soft padding and find their face pressed into fabric with nowhere for air to flow. Babies lack the strength to push away or turn their heads when breathing becomes difficult, and the softness that seemed so comforting became a suffocation risk parents never imagined. Tragedy after tragedy accumulated before safety experts connected the pattern. Studies revealed that crib bumpers contributed to infant deaths at alarming rates. Regulators eventually banned the sale of thick crib bumpers, leaving parents to reconsider everything they thought they knew about making a nursery safe. Lead-soldered stained glass tree toppers crowned Christmas trees in the 1980s with handcrafted elegance that mass-produced plastic stars could never match. Families treasured these delicate pieces, often receiving them as wedding gifts or inheriting them from grandparents who valued artisan craftsmanship. The colored glass caught tree lights beautifully, casting rainbow patterns across ceilings and walls while everyone gathered below to exchange presents. What made these toppers so structurally sound was the lead solder holding each piece of glass together, applied by craftspeople who worked without gloves or ventilation. Every time someone placed the topper on the tree, adjusted its position, or packed it away, tiny particles of lead transferred onto hands that later touched faces and food. Children lifted onto shoulders to place the star were exposed directly, their small fingers gripping the metal seams without anyone imagining the danger. When health authorities documented lead's devastating effects on developing brains, these handcrafted treasures became hazardous heirlooms. The artistry that once elevated holiday decorating now carries warnings about handling and display. Neighborhood tree-burning events after Christmas were practically a community ritual in the 1970s. Once the holidays were over, families would drag their old trees to a designated spot, sometimes a park or an empty lot, and watch them go up in flames with everyone gathered around. The fire shot up fast, fueled by the dryness of the pine needles, and the heat would hit your face before you even stepped close. People brought cocoa, told stories, and treated it like one final celebration before the long winter settled in. There was a strange beauty in watching the last symbol of Christmas burn away, a feeling that the season was ending with a bang rather than a quiet whimper. Today, though, the idea of burning trees in a communal fire is strictly illegal. Air pollution laws, fire safety risks, and local regulations shut down anything that involves open burning of plant material. What was once a neighborhood farewell to the holiday season is now viewed as dangerous and irresponsible. but the memory of those glowing piles of branches remains vivid for anyone who stood beside them, feeling both warmth and closure in the orange light. Deep-fried fish sticks made with trans fats were a cafeteria treasure that arrived every Friday like clockwork, golden and crispy and practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. Kids lined up eagerly because Fish Stick Day meant something special, a break from the usual rotation that felt almost celebratory. The breading crackled with each bite, giving way to flaky white fish that tasted vaguely of the ocean and heavily of the deep fryer. What nobody realized was that those fryers bubbled with partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, a cooking fat that made everything crispier and quietly dangerous. Lunch ladies loaded baskets and lowered them into shimmering pools of oil reused all week, each batch absorbing more trans fats that scientists would later connect to heart disease. Parents assumed fried fish was still healthy, still a reasonable choice for growing children. Schools kept serving them because the cost was low and the kids kept eating. But when the truth about trans fats finally surfaced, regulators moved fast. Today, partially hydrogenated oils are completely banned from school kitchens, and the fish sticks that remain taste different, lacking the signature crunch of the forbidden fats. Drop-side cribs with unstable latches were considered a blessing for parents in the 1970s, offering a clever design that made lifting babies in and out much easier on tired backs. The side panel slid down smoothly, allowing parents to reach their little ones without straining over a fixed rail. Nurseries across the country were filled with these cribs, often passed down through siblings because they seemed so practical. Nobody questioned the latches that held the movable side in place, trusting that something sold for babies must have been tested beyond doubt. But the latches were not as reliable as families believed. Over time, the hardware loosened, panels shifted, and gaps appeared between the mattress and the side rail. Babies rolled into those gaps, became trapped, and some never woke up. The tragedies mounted quietly at first, scattered across different towns before anyone connected them to a single design flaw. When investigators traced the pattern, the findings were devastating. Regulators banned drop-side cribs entirely, forcing families to discard furniture they had trusted with their children's lives. It remains a heartbreaking reminder that convenience should never come before safety. Cadmium red painted wooden ornaments hung from Christmas trees across the country in the 1980s, their bright crimson finish adding that perfect pop of traditional holiday color. Families loved how the rich red shades stood out against green branches, catching light in ways that made even simple wooden shapes look festive. Craft stores sold them by the dozen, and parents often let children help paint additional ornaments at home using similar commercial paints without checking labels. The vivid red pigment that made these ornaments so appealing came from cadmium, a toxic heavy metal that created colors more brilliant than safer alternatives could achieve. Every time someone handled the ornaments, adjusted their placement, or brushed against them while reaching for presents, tiny particles of cadmium paint transferred onto skin. Children who put ornaments in their mouths or touched them and then ate cookies absorbed the metal directly. When researchers documented cadmium's dangers, including kidney damage and bone weakening, regulators banned its use in consumer products. The cheerful red that once symbolized Christmas spirit became a cautionary tale about hidden ingredients. Partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening was the invisible ingredient that made everything in the cafeteria taste better, richer, and more satisfying than it had any right to be. Cooks used it for frying, baking, and greasing every pan that produced the foods children loved most. The shortening came in large containers beside industrial stoves, scooped out by the cupful and melted into recipes passed down through decades of school food service. Nobody questioned it because nobody knew there was anything to question. Trans fats extended shelf life, improved texture, and cost far less than butter or other alternatives. The cookies were flakier, the pie crusts more tender, and the fried foods crispier because of this single ingredient that touched nearly everything on the menu. But scientists discovered that trans fats raised bad cholesterol while lowering the good kind, creating a cardiovascular danger that lurked in every bite. When evidence became undeniable, regulators banned partially hydrogenated oils entirely. School kitchens had to reformulate everything, replacing the shortening that had defined cafeteria cooking for generations. The foods remain, but they taste different now. Nitrocellulose-coated paper chains hung in loops across 1980s living rooms, their shiny surfaces catching light and adding festive color to every corner. Children spent hours at kitchen tables cutting strips, gluing links together, and coating them with lacquer sprays that made the paper gleam like something from a department store display. The craft was a beloved holiday tradition, teaching patience and creativity while producing decorations the whole family could admire. What nobody realized was that nitrocellulose, the compound making that glossy finish possible, was essentially the same material used in early film stock notorious for fires. The coated chains hung near fireplaces, candles, and hot light bulbs, inches away from ignition sources that could transform innocent decorations into fast-spreading flames. Families strung them across rooms without understanding how quickly fire could race along those shiny links. When fire safety experts documented the risks of nitrocellulose in home crafts, the sprays were reformulated or discontinued. The cheerful paper chains that represented family togetherness became cautionary examples of flammable beauty. Using asbestos-based fake snow for decor sounds unthinkable today, but in the 1970s it was still floating around in attics, storage boxes, and leftover holiday supplies from even earlier decades. Families sprinkled it across mantels, nativity scenes, and Christmas village displays without a hint of hesitation because it looked stunningly real. It clung beautifully, stayed in place, and made every surface look winter-kissed, even if the weather outside refused to cooperate. Most people never imagined that the soft white powder carried risks far beyond messiness. The word asbestos simply did not trigger panic yet, at least not in the way it does today. Back then, you were more focused on making your holiday decor look as magical as possible, especially if you were working on a budget and wanted your home to feel special. Today, possession or use of anything containing asbestos can bring legal trouble, health warnings, and removal orders. It is one of those dramatic shifts where science taught us something we wish we had known earlier. But when people look back at old photos, they do not remember the danger. They remember the tiny hillside of white powder beneath the ceramic houses, the shimmer on the mantel, and how perfectly it tied the whole scene together. Canned fruit swimming in heavy syrup was a cafeteria staple that made fruit feel like dessert, each spoonful glistening with sugary liquid that pooled at the bottom of the bowl. Peach halves, pear slices, and fruit cocktail arrived in industrial cans that lunch workers opened before portioning the contents into small dishes. The syrup was thick and sweet, the kind of liquid children instinctively drank after finishing the fruit itself. Schools served it proudly because it counted as a fruit serving, checking a nutritional box without requiring the expense of fresh produce. Parents assumed their children were eating something healthy because the word fruit appeared on the menu. But those heavy syrups contained enough added sugar to rival candy, turning what should have been a wholesome choice into something far less innocent. When regulators examined the sugar content hiding in school fruit servings, heavy syrup became an immediate target. Today, canned fruit in schools must be packed in water, natural juice, or light syrup containing a fraction of the sugar children once consumed without question. The fruit tastes different now, less like a treat and more like what it always should have been. Lead-painted nursery furniture filled baby rooms across the 1970s with bright yellows, cheerful blues, and soft pinks that made every crib and changing table look like something out of a storybook. Parents carefully selected these pieces, believing the vivid colors would stimulate their babies and create a warm, welcoming space for their newest family member. What nobody realized was that lead hid inside those beautiful colors, waiting to flake off into tiny chips that curious babies would find and place directly into their mouths. Lead poisoning does not announce itself loudly. It builds silently, damaging developing brains and nervous systems in ways that might not appear for years. Children chewed on crib rails during teething, rubbed their fingers along painted edges, and inhaled dust particles that settled on sheets and blankets. By the time researchers connected lead exposure to developmental delays, countless families had already unknowingly harmed the children they were trying so hard to protect. Regulators banned lead paint for consumer products, but the legacy of those cheerful nurseries lingers as a painful reminder of how danger can hide behind the brightest colors. Aluminum icicles with sharp, unfinished edges dangled from trees in the 1980s like frozen rain caught mid-fall, their metallic surfaces reflecting every color from surrounding lights. Families bought them in bulk, tossing handfuls onto branches until trees sparkled with that retro shimmer that felt quintessentially festive. Kids loved helping, grabbing fistfuls of thin metal strips and draping them anywhere they could reach. But these icicles were manufactured cheaply, stamped from aluminum sheets and packaged without any smoothing process. The edges remained razor-sharp, capable of slicing fingers with even gentle handling. Children often discovered this painfully, ending up with cuts that parents dismissed as minor holiday hazards. Beyond the cuts, these metal icicles conducted electricity if they fell across light strands or touched exposed wiring, creating shock risks nobody anticipated from simple decorations. When safety advocates documented injuries and electrical dangers, regulations required edge finishing or discontinuation. The sparkling icicles that once seemed like harmless festive additions became symbols of an era when safety standards lagged behind holiday enthusiasm. Loose-fitting crib sheets were a quiet hazard that nobody in the 1970s thought to question, because fitted sheets for baby mattresses simply did not fit the way modern parents expect. Mothers tucked corners under as best they could, smoothing fabric across mattresses that never quite matched the dimensions printed on packaging. The sheets bunched, shifted, and pulled free during the night, creating folds and pockets of loose material inside the crib. Parents checked on their babies and saw rumpled fabric, assuming it was nothing more than evidence of restless sleep. But loose sheets can wrap around tiny faces, cover mouths and noses, and create barriers to breathing that infants cannot escape on their own. The danger was invisible to exhausted parents who trusted that a simple piece of fabric could not possibly cause harm. Suffocation incidents mounted over the years, and investigators traced deaths back to bedding that had come undone. Safety standards eventually required fitted sheets to grip mattresses securely, with elastic strong enough to stay in place. Families remember tucking those sheets repeatedly, never realizing how close they came to tragedy with every corner that slipped free. Full-fat cheese smothering nachos and pizza was one of the great pleasures of 80s school lunches, thick orange layers that stretched and pulled with every bite. Pizza day meant rectangles of dough buried under blankets of melted cheese glistening under heat lamps, while nacho day brought mountains of chips covered in warm cheese sauce dripping from every edge. Kids devoured these meals without a thought about fat content or dietary consequences. Cheese was simply delicious, a food group unto itself that made everything taste better. Schools served it generously because children actually ate their lunches when cheese was involved, solving the problem of wasted food and hungry afternoon students. The cheese came from massive blocks or industrial bags, measured by the handful rather than the ounce. But full-fat dairy carried more saturated fat than nutritionists eventually deemed acceptable for growing children. When federal guidelines restricted the types of cheese schools could serve, cafeterias switched to reduced fat versions that melted differently and tasted less rich. Students today eat pizza and nachos that look similar but lack the indulgent quality that made those meals legendary. PVC blow mold yard figures with toxic plasticizers stood proudly on lawns throughout the 1980s, their cheerful Santas and snowmen glowing from internal bulbs that made neighborhoods feel magical after dark. Families collected them over years, adding new figures each season until entire yards became illuminated winter wonderlands. Children loved running between them, touching their smooth plastic surfaces and peering inside at the warm orange glow of incandescent bulbs. These figures were made from polyvinyl chloride softened with plasticizers that made the material flexible enough to mold into complex shapes. Under summer storage heat and winter bulb warmth, those plasticizers slowly migrated to the surface and released fumes that drifted across yards where families gathered. The chemicals responsible for making the plastic pliable were later linked to hormone disruption, especially troubling for children who spent hours playing near the glowing figures. When regulations tightened around these compounds, manufacturers scrambled to reformulate. The beloved yard decorations that defined neighborhood holiday spirit became symbols of an era that prioritized appearance over safety. Community bonfires using unregulated materials were another festive tradition that belonged to a different world entirely. You would see families tossing in scraps of old fencing, broken furniture, untreated wood, and sometimes even boxes or paper left over from the holiday madness. The bonfire would roar to life, sending sparks spiraling into the winter air like fireflies trying to escape the heat. People gathered around with warm drinks, shared stories, and treated it as a way to come together when the weather tried to push everyone apart. Nobody checked whether the materials were safe to burn. Nobody asked about air quality. It was simply a tradition born from practicality and a desire to be together. Today, though, burning anything other than clean, approved wood is illegal. Environmental regulations forbid the release of toxic fumes, and burning household materials can result in fines or even legal action. It is a reminder that the world has grown more cautious and more regulated. But the memory of standing around a roaring fire, bundled up and laughing with neighbors, is something no law can erase. Salisbury steak drenched in high-sodium gravy was the kind of cafeteria comfort food that made even picky eaters clean their trays in the 1980s. The oval-shaped patties arrived swimming in thick brown sauce that glistened under serving line lights, looking like something from a home-cooked dinner. Kids loved how the gravy soaked into everything it touched, turning mashed potatoes into a savory puddle and making even overcooked vegetables taste acceptable. Lunch ladies ladled it generously, sometimes giving extra to students who asked politely. The saltiness was part of the appeal, that rich, almost addictive flavor that made you want to scrape every last drop from your tray. Nobody questioned the sodium content because nobody thought about sodium at all. It was simply good food that filled bellies and kept students happy through afternoon classes. But when nutritionists examined what schools actually served, the sodium levels in that beloved gravy raised immediate alarms. Federal guidelines now cap sodium strictly, and the gravy that once defined Salisbury Steak Day has been reformulated into something far less indulgent. Baby powder with pure talc was one of the most trusted items in any 1970s nursery, a soft white cloud that parents dusted onto babies after every diaper change. The powder smelled clean and fresh, absorbing moisture and leaving skin feeling silky smooth in a way that seemed like the definition of good baby care. Mothers shook it generously, creating little puffs that floated through the air and settled onto changing tables and floors. Nobody questioned the ritual because it had been passed down through generations, a symbol of tenderness and attention to comfort. But talc carried risks that families never imagined. The fine particles drifted into tiny lungs with every breath, and some talc deposits were later found to be contaminated with asbestos, a known carcinogen that clings to tissue and never lets go. Babies inhaled powder meant to soothe them, and parents had no idea they were introducing a danger that could linger for a lifetime. When researchers connected talc exposure to respiratory problems and potential cancer risks, the backlash was swift. Regulators restricted talc in baby products, and manufacturers scrambled to reformulate powders that families had trusted for decades. Town parades throwing unwrapped candy at crowds was one of the purest delights of Christmas in the 1970s. Parade floats would inch slowly down the street while performers and volunteers tossed handfuls of brightly colored treats into cheering crowds. Children scrambled joyfully to pick them up, stuffing pockets and mittens with their sugary loot. There was always a burst of laughter when a piece bounced off a boot or skidded across the pavement like a tiny comet. No one cared that the candy was unwrapped. It was part of the thrill. And parents loved watching their kids dive after sweets like treasure hunters on a winter adventure. Nobody worried about wrappers, allergies, or sanitation. It was just part of the fun, a tiny burst of excitement in the middle of winter. Today, though, this practice is banned almost everywhere. Injury risks, food safety rules, and liability concerns have shut it down. Wrapped candy is allowed in some places, but even that comes with restrictions. Still, the memory of a flying piece of candy arcing through the cold air is something many people hold close. Formaldehyde-treated artificial garlands were draped across mantels, staircases, and doorways in nearly every 1980s home, their lush green appearance lasting season after season without wilting. Families loved how realistic they looked compared to older plastic versions, and the convenience of never replacing them made the investment worthwhile. Parents wrapped them around banisters while children helped secure them with ribbons, everyone breathing in that faint chemical smell nobody questioned. The garlands held their shape because manufacturers treated them with formaldehyde, a preservative that slowly released invisible fumes throughout the holiday season. Every time someone walked past or adjusted a draped section, more chemical escaped into living spaces where families gathered. Children sleeping near decorated doorways breathed the vapors all night without anyone realizing the exposure was happening. When researchers connected formaldehyde off-gassing to respiratory irritation and long-term concerns, regulations forced manufacturers to find safer methods. The garlands that once seemed like smart investments became reminders of how convenience can mask invisible dangers. If any of these forbidden 80s parenting moments brought back memories, share your story in the comments below. Tap like to keep the nostalgia alive, and subscribe so you never miss another journey into the childhood we once knew.